Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Students of Storrs Podcast, episode 13, presented to you by Gansett Raps. I'm your host, Noam Watt, and I'm joined again today by Doug Glanville, former Major League Baseball player, distinguished journalist, and my professor this semester in the Sport and Society course in the UConn Sport Management Department. Professor, thanks so much for joining me today. First and foremost, how are you doing, and how has the start of your semester been?
Yeah, appreciate you having me on. It's as you know, we're still navigating this world we're in, and when you're teaching a class like Sport and Society, with this, it's a special time, and trying to understand in real time things that are changing so dynamically, and you recognize athletes have taken a stance and a position in sort of across leagues and across seemingly generations. So it's something that we're trying to evolve as we go, but it's a blur at times. And so I'd say so far, so good. We've had a couple of classes, and we're going to continue to try to bring in current events to shape the course, because it seems like any 24-hour period, you could have an entire different storyline. So, but yeah, it's great to be here. So I'm enjoying the feedback, and we'll continue to expand the course as the news continues to change.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, almost something new every 24 hours. It's exciting. It's inspiring, and you're going to continue to join us through the semester to discuss, the intersection between sports and society, which is as relevant as ever, arguably, right now. But I want to start with the biggest sports news, arguably in years, which came from the NBA bubble when the Milwaukee Bucks boycotted their first-round game against the Magic about a week and a half ago. What was your first reaction when you saw the teams were boycotting the game?
I mean, it was wow. I mean, I think it just sort of stepped back and saw how this unfolded. I mean, even the Orlando Magic were a little bit caught off guard. But what I did recognize was that, Milwaukee, with the sight of Kenosha and Jacob Blake with the police, it seemed to kind of coalesce around this moment. And the Bucks took a position to wield certain powers that probably hadn't been exercised in quite some time, certainly in the way that it was done. And, they thought about it, and they decided to take a position, and then it kind of rippled through the league. Looking back in some ways, some of it was understanding, given that Sterling Brown also plays for the Milwaukee Bucks, and he had his own incident being tasered in the Walgreens parking lot, and as a player basically, and he took it and actually is still taking it far. He did not decide to say, hey, let me have a settlement. And he ended up saying, no, I want to change this culture. I want to make sure that this doesn't happen to someone else. And he's really making an effort. And that was a big stance. And I think what was subtle about what happened with Sterling Brown was that the Milwaukee Bucks then issued a full-blown statement, very critical of the Milwaukee Police Department. And I think that was unprecedented in its own right, because you had a team, an organization, stand by the player. They didn't avoid it. They jump right into the fray. So I think that issue cannot be understated as to sort of coloring how Milwaukee as an organization, the Bucks, would see these incidents. And because they've been now pretty versed in the relationship between police and community of colors after their own player went through this experience. So and so, as we've seen, it's been somewhat of a domino effect. They set the tone, and other leagues and sports got involved.
So you said that the Bucks put out a statement back then, and a lot of teams are using their social media platforms specifically now to, in little ways, try and raise awareness. So, for example, the Celtics, during halftime every game, they're tweeting the score, but they're also saying, use this break to sign up to vote, to make sure you're registered to vote. And these are the little things, just bringing awareness, making it a more mainstream conversation about how can we improve this country, how can we make sure all of our voices are heard. Protest, one of the best ways to make sure that your voice is heard. And while this was one of the more monumental protests in sports, it certainly wasn't the first one. The Los Angeles Sparks, for example, in 2017, stayed in their locker room during the anthem of a playoff game, a move that would, written back then, quote, rock the sports world to its very core if the same thing happened in the NBA. Lo and behold, the same thing and more happens in the NBA. And also John Thompson, who just passed away last week, the legendary Georgetown coach, He staged a boycott of his own back in 1989 when he walked out of a game against BC to protest Proposition 42. Now, Proposition 42 is a rule that would take away scholarship from athletes who were deemed academically ineligible. At the time, Thompson said that if these kids today don't get that opportunity, who are they going to look to? Not only was he a tremendous coach who won a national championship for Georgetown, but Thompson was dedicated specifically to the welfare of his community above anything else. And he also gets a lot of credit for opening the door for minority coaches, which is something that all leagues are still really struggling with today. So just give me quick thoughts on Thompson's legacy and the idea that while the current protests are getting a lot of attention and backlash from many, including the president, these protests aren't exactly new to sports.
Well, no, I think first, John Thompson was an icon and is an icon in the sense of his legacy continuing on, because, as you mentioned, just setting the tone for what's possible for black coaches and opportunity. He was larger than life, literally coached some incredible talent, but set a certain tone and standard about expectations about players. You think about Allen Iverson in saying, look, it's more than just saying, hey, you're a talented player, I just want you part of my program because I want to win. He wanted to develop people. He wanted to invest in the whole person, the whole athlete, and also just be someone who was concerned about giving people second chances. You saw Iverson speak about how nobody was going to give him a shot after that incident. He just felt like that was it. And Thompson was like, no, you can come here. But he set some ground rules. And yet he still understood players' background, where they're coming from, to be able to adjust and adapt to recognizing that there isn't necessarily one way to be successful in your story. And I love the fact that he saw that future for all his players, that he could see that this is a growth period. They're 18 years old, 19 to 17. I mean, they're young men that he could influence. And so I think his protest was saying, hey, find a way to help these students. Don't just give up on them or cut them off. Find a way to help them. You brought them here often with an understanding about a promise of what could happen as an athlete, but also as a promise of the education that they can have. And part of it is supporting them. And so that was a great tone. And I just remember, kind of coming up and seeing the Hoyas in this light, just sort of, they had a certain gold standard to them about and it was all set by John Thompson. So with respect to protest, yes, it has been, hugely part of the legacy throughout sports. And I think that's always understated, because the stick to sports really hasn't ever been the case, throughout time. In fact, sports a long time ago, pre-Civil War, became a way to evaluate candidates. They were called campaign races for a reason. They were races. They were boxing matches. They were separating candidacy based on their ability to compete. And so it changed when Black and immigrant populations started to become engaged in the process post-Civil War. And I think that's what's so interesting about the way we look at this, the effort of inclusion or voting, how the rules and the games can change when certain disenfranchised groups of people rise up and try to be part of the process. And what the NBA and others are trying to do is to bring that back and connect the dots. Well, the connection makes a lot of sense, because as Clara Smith, a colleague of mine at ESPN, said, it's Black royalty. These athletes often early over time, and even today, had the access. They had the power and the ability to shape the culture. And there was a time where nobody else was even allowed to the table unless you were clergy or Martin Luther King or that level. So the athletes like Jackie Robinson knew that they were the avenues by which change could happen. And if they were silent, then very little would happen, because most workers who were Black did not have the access or the power to be able to make that change unless they were doing it in mass. And Montgomery bus, for example, was effective, but that's what it took. And it took a real coalition of people. And so what we're seeing today, I think that is different, is that you're seeing players, sports, activism as a team, which is now expanded. Leagues are involved, communities supporting leagues. I mean, you're seeing, and it's happening across sports. It's not just NBA who has a certain Black demographic. You're seeing Major League Baseball. You're seeing NASCAR. You're seeing everywhere.
Yeah,
WNBA is always led in this regard, always. And It certainly doesn't receive enough credit for the boldness and so much at stake, by the way, from these players. And I think some of the players in WNBA have had to be activists from the day they showed up because of just the inequity from gender dynamics and so many other issues. So I think that's the difference. You're seeing across sports, regardless of the demographics, are all trying to find a place to express frustration and a desire for change.
There's one image particularly powerful from the WNBA where the entire league was in one gymnasium standing together on the day where all their games were boycotted. And that image, it says wonders about that league because, like you said, that league has been at the forefront and it doesn't get the attention it deserves because the media doesn't cover it as much. Sponsors don't pay as much into it. People don't watch it as much. And yet, they've been at the forefront of this charge for years, constantly fighting for equal pay, better conditions to work in. They just passed a very good CBA this past year. That was a huge step forward for them. But it's great to see, like you said, all these leagues coming together. NASCAR, a league that, quite frankly, doesn't really care about being diverse and equal. They just want their money. But they made that business decision that's a really tough one, ban the Confederate flag because it was the right thing to do. So while they may lose a sector of their fan base, they're doing the right thing and they're making a positive change, even though it might hurt them on the bottom line. The MLB, predominantly white, almost all, if not all, the owners and GMs are white, and they're making a stand, led by players like Mookie Betts. These athletes who have the support of their teammates behind them like never before in history. All these protests, it's neat to see all the leagues coming together. Yes, the Milwaukee Bucks were the first one to decide to boycott, but every league stood with them in solidarity as well.
Yeah, you see the power in that, and I think that's the distinction. They realized their power. They said, wait a minute, we could withhold this, in some degree a product, but also just their performance, their talent, and they realized that, there's going to be a response. And I think because of the diversity of these leagues, as you mentioned, there's something powerful that you're trying to put humanity at the center. Although it's an issue of race that has sort of sparked so much, you're starting to say, hey, well, it doesn't matter where I come from or look like. This is a human issue, and we need to be better. We need to treat each other better, and we need to really look at the systems in place that are disadvantaging groups of people just because of the color of their skin. That is a human issue, and the fact that they've embraced that on so many different ways and different levels is encouraging.
So let's talk about going forward. In class, sport and society class, we're starting to talk about conventional versus systems thinking. The idea of conventional, just sort of addressing problems with a basic Band-Aid solution, versus systems thinking where you're truly working to fix, the underlying causes, the issues. So what do you expect or hope to see from these protests? And then can you tell the listeners a little bit more about the conventional and systems thinking model as well?
Well, absolutely. I think, foundationally, one of the books I use all the time since I've been teaching is David Peter Stroh's book on system thinking for social change. He kind of applies a model and overlays it on how social change has these complexities that can be unique, but also still can be designed for to a certain degree. So it gives you a little a strategic way to look at it, and it uses sort of an algorithmic approach. But it's steeped in, social discussion and strategy that I think is universally important when we talk about making sustainable change. For example, if you're looking at, if you're in office and you only have a two-year term limit, you're going to make decisions that may benefit your ability to stay in office, and that might be short term, but that may not be what is necessary for something like systemic racism, which is generations. It's hard to undo that. It's impossible to undo that in a 2-year term. So you always have this collision between short-term gain and long-term success. And Stroh tries to kind of unearth how these strategies are sort of conventional in thought and how you have to shift to systems thinking if you want to create change that actually lasts and becomes structural. And that's, so I think when you apply that to sports today and how they're engaging on these issues, you want to see protests, you want to see the ability to raise the issue and keep it in people's consciousness, because that is important, certainly from a media standpoint or an attention standpoint. But then you have to do the slow work behind the scenes that involves policy and shifts and legislation and and sort of long-term education, where you have to really work at changing the hearts and minds, where you see that common humanity that we share. And so what I'd like to see from the leagues is that what is that next step? We may not be there yet. You're still kind of raising awareness. But what is that next step? What are the steps that need to be taken? What's the focal point? Is it just policing? If you're talking about systemic issues, then you're looking at housing and environmental discrimination. You go Flint, Michigan. You could go on and on. So there has to be not only a long-term plan, which is going to take everybody to a large degree, voting in the process and so on. But you also need to continue to connect the dots as to what are the common threads that may allow you to simplify it in a way to search to what ties us together, finding that commonality. That's got to ring true through many groups of people, that many of which may not be the directly aggrieved population. You have to see ourselves in each other. You have to see the struggle of the WNBA players to getting a voice at the table within racial injustice, within gender discrimination. You have to connect that. I think that's the larger human challenge, recognizing that race brings its own unique tenor to the symphony of our relationships, and that's going to be certainly first and foremost right now when you're talking about how the NBA has been responding.
So, big decision in the NBA was, do they stay in the bubble or do they cancel the season, go back home, and continue to work in their own communities? And during the players' meeting after the first day of boycotts, Jaylen Brown, Celtics guard, pressed players saying they should only leave the bubble if they truly plan to take to the streets and fight against racial inequality. Now, I remember Jaylen Brown's rookie year, 2017. I went to the Celtics game on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and he gave the pregame speech. And back then, 4 years ago, a rookie Jaylen Brown was a leader, and he's even more so now, a major reason, quite frankly, why players are still in the bubble. The Clippers and Lakers both sort of informally voted that they were just going to cancel their season and go home. After that players' meeting, Jaylen Brown and a group of players convinced the NBA to stay in the bubble, continue to shine a light on these inequalities. What do you make of the players' ultimate decision to stay in Orlando, and what would you have done if you were a player there?
Sometimes you just need time and perspective, which is sometimes it can be lost in the Twitterverse at times. But what you recognize is when you look at it differently, you say, wait a minute, there's a lot of power that we're in this bubble, right? First of all, it took a lot of power to create this environment, and you start to question it, I'm sure, over time. It's like when I used to play against the Montreal Expos for 4 days inside a dome, where we went to the hotel, walked to the train station, never saw the light of day, played the game, went back to the hotel. You're like, wait a minute. Like you do get a different feeling about, I could be a centerpiece in this basketball bubble, where we're on a stage in a way that everybody's kind of paying attention. And they started to look at the possibilities and the power of playing, and saying, well, maybe we can play, but there's through certain terms and certain understanding. And as Anthony Davis said, say, well, look, if they act a fool, we could just withhold our services again. We'll stop playing again. And like you mentioned, it is significant to have young players speaking. It doesn't matter what generation, they're all, kind of coming together on this. I remember I gave a equivalent to a lecture to the Major League Baseball rookie development camp, a lot of the young players. And then it was just hard to see baseball's, possibility here, and also hard to see would young rookie players speak out. So I think there were some comments about my lecture that saying, well, when are they going to use this? And I thought that was kind of ironic in the end, because you started to realize that young players, rookie players, certainly have a tremendous voice, and whether they are directly addressing it or not, it might come to their table anyway, right? So, so there's no question that it's span. That's what makes it so unique. It's generational. It's transcending different sports, whatever their demographics, gender. I mean, it's really quite widespread.
So it's actually a good segue. I wanted to switch gears back to your sport, obviously baseball. August 28th was Jackie Robinson Day this year. It was postponed as the league had to play late this year due to the pandemic. But this was an emotional weekend for baseball with the boycotts of games. And also that night, Chadwick Boseman, who played Jackie in the movie 42, passed away after a 4-year battle with colon cancer. It was the end of a stretch of days where players and teams decided to boycott their games, which, if you think 5-10 years back, you never would think that Major League Baseball would do something like that. What conversations have you had with people inside your baseball circle about both these protests and how significant it is that they fell around Jackie Robinson Day this year?
Yeah, baseball, it's been tremendous to watch. It's a game that is considered, they had Jackie Robinson sort of that moment, and then it was kind of quiet in a sense. You have Roberto Clemente, you still have to consider him also a tremendous activist, but in terms of the league's response, it's been sluggish and mostly just sitting back and watching. But I know in recent times they've done better to employ the Selig rule, requiring diverse candidates to be interviewed for pretty much every job in the game. And that has yielded pretty good results. They've gotten some positive. Now they're still struggling at the highest level of baseball, ownership, commissioner level, and managers on the field. They're still having challenges there, especially when you have such tremendous diversity, international diversity. And so baseball's trying to think about those next steps. And they pushed the envelope in ways that I know it hasn't been their comfort zone, whether it's Black Lives Matter at the draft or the Red Sox big giant billboard, as you said, the demonstrations or symbolism on opening day. I think the challenge they've had is within the diversity, and I tend to be very patient with this because it is tremendously diverse, and you have different ways to think about how to express their desire for elevating humanity to be a true team, not just on the field, but off the field in the team of America. I think that's a challenge because you have a player from like Yu Darvish who's from Japan still trying to, let me see how this works. And so there should be some patience to see how they come together around it. And so you're getting what is a little bit messy, right, in terms of different ways to do it. But it is messy, and it's not something you could say, all right, I'm going to have the perfect protest today and everything's solved. The real key work is still the slow work. That's still going to be the work that's going to change laws and things along those lines. And so so personally, I have a former roommate of mine who's basically the only black, between the players and the coaches, is the only black representative. And we've talked periodically, and I remember him thinking, well, do I kneel? Do I do, just sort of, it wasn't straightforward. It wasn't easy. And but he's done a lot to just try to keep awareness and try to tie people together as a team, tapping the best of sports. And that is, you're playing as a team of people from all different walks of life, and you prioritize something bigger than self and even your own community, because the game is supposed to be the priority and its integrity. And also your environments professionally where you have rules that govern the way you play, and they're supposed to be applied equitably and fairly across the board, no matter where you're from, no matter what team, what jersey you're wearing. And that is something that players have always lived through in the professional realm and college realm, that they've always tried to keep that at the center. And that's a good example for our country.
I want to close by paying tribute to Chadwick Boseman. In his 2018 commencement speech at his alma mater, Howard, he said that purpose crosses discipline. Purpose is an essential element of you. It is the reason you are on the planet at this particular time in history. Your very existence is wrapped up in the things you are here to fulfill. And I think that this, more than ever, is applicable as athletes around the professional leagues are using their platform and their voice to push for change, to push for a more just society, a more just place, just like the games they're playing in, where fairness is at the centerpiece, and they're constantly working to make things better, to make things fairer for people. And just what an emotional week for sports. The NBA boycotts, John Thompson's death, who was a pioneer for social justice, Black Lives Matter movement in Major League Baseball on Jackie Robinson weekend, and then Chadwick Boseman's death, who's just an all-time legend. I just want to ask if you have any final thoughts on what we've witnessed in the intersection between sport and society in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, it's head spinning. It really is, but I'm proud to be part of the sports community. Very proud of it because personally, I've always rejected stick to sports. I thought it's always ridiculous. I understand sort of the business sensibility around that, but then when it comes to these athletes' impact on our world, it's undeniable, and it's always been undeniable to a large degree. Sports are incredibly significant. And although, it's not essential workers, the spirit of it and what we can gain as a country when we embrace the best of sports is essential. I think allows us to be a better team, and a bigger team than our nation and our world. And I look at, Chadwick Boseman. I mean, it felt like, I lost an uncle or a brother. I mean, because of what he not only represented on screen, but just what he represented off screen. And those type of figures, don't come along often, right? And you want to see their legacy preserved with them as part of it, right? They're passing and they're making adjustments and they're changing the world. And he was that type of figure. I mean, I just look at my kids and, I think about how, my daughter has her Black Panther pajamas and, it's the power of having images that look like you. And although, yes, one day you want to say it'd be great if we could just melt away differences that can be so toxic, but we should, instead of shooting for be colorblind, we just want to respect each other's walk and find a way to be a team, a better team. And we're not there yet. We're not at the place where we can say, we're just going to forget all these things. And if you stop reading about slavery, we'll just forget about it. And we are so far from that because we haven't reckoned with our own history. We're still in denial about those stories and who was at the table and how to move forward. So part of it is unlearning or relearning an education. It's very fitting. We're talking about this through campus life and so on. But I think of Black Panther or Hamilton the musical, right? These are way bigger than just good plays or good movies or actors. It's about opportunity. It's about equity. It's about inclusion and fairness and denial and pain, and that's the story. And in the Black experience, you don't have the luxury to say, oh well, I'm just going to stick to sports. I'm just going to I've never had that luxury to just be, and yeah, there's times it'd be nice, but then I go home, then I drive home, then I try to shovel my driveway, then I try to get a cab, then I try to, and how do I not use the power I have in my sport to try to change those circumstances, not just for me and my own edification, but for everyone. I think that's the opportunity, and there's a way to do it. There's a way to do it that we can still watch our basketball games. There's a way to do it. And I was fortunate to write an essay for ESPN called Enough. And that essay, there was a lot of fear around that because we're commenting on George Floyd. But we were able to do it a way to thread the needle and still be unapologetic about the issues. And I think that's why, for one reason I love being part of a college environment at the University of Connecticut, because there's a team. And the education is reciprocal, right? It's students. I learn as much from my students as I teach. And that's the way we need to listen to each other and come together around that spirit.
And at the end of the day, if things are not right in society, how can we turn a blind eye? How can I, as a white male, ignore things that are going on that are targeting people of color? I will never experience it because I'm a white male. But that means that I have to push extra hard to fight for equality, because at the end of the day, when I click off the sports game, I go back to my normal life. But when a black man clicks off the sports game, he still may be targeted in a way that I'm not. We can't turn a blind eye. We need to continue these conversations. And sports are an unbelievable vehicle because at the end of the day, we can all be one team.
No, I feel you, man. And I think it starts with empathy. It's a very important word. And I don't think just because you may not have my skin tone doesn't mean that we can't be incredible teammates in this world. And I think everybody has a role here. Everybody has power here to change things. And I always go back, elevating humanity. You have to put that at the center, as all of us being people, all of us being human, and recognize that, yes, it's a different experience. And part of it is understanding that experience and listening, but going back and we're in this class, there's so much to unearth in history that we can say, wait a minute, just simply by saying, well, it didn't actually happen the way I used to think of it, right? It actually happened in a different way. NFL did not have a national anthem, where players weren't even on the field before 2009, in national anthem in the NFL. And you kind of think, oh, well, wait a minute, this was a long-standing legacy. No, it actually was fairly recent where the anthem was played where everybody was kind of expected to be on the field in their relationship with the military from the standpoint of the contract the NFL had. So, you just kind of realize that just understanding that you just get a different perspective, and that exchange is important. So, I appreciate the, being able to discuss this, and I hope we'll continue to do so outside of our class included. So we'll see what happens.
Absolutely. Well, Professor Glanville, thank you so much for bringing your perspective to UCTV Sports and to UConn. I'm really just grateful to be having these conversations, to be in your class, to continue learning about all these intersections between sport and society that we need to discuss more. So thank you all for listening, for tuning in. We'll be doing this throughout the semester, so stay tuned and be well, everybody. Thanks again, Professor Glanville.
Thank you.